So big welcome to everyone. It's lovely to catch up with you all again. And the major task of today's session is going to be to focus on assignment 3, what is required, to give you some helps and guidelines. And so if after half an hour or 3/4 of an hour you feel there's some major pieces of information that you're missing out on, certainly speak up, let us know, and we will do all we can to help you along the journey. Can I say right at the beginning, it's my belief that if you put in 10 hours per week into this subject, you spend 2, 3, 4, 5 hours or so looking at the material, getting to know those insights that are provided on YouTube and in the articles. And then you also spend a similar amount of time, 4 or 5 hours or so a week, working on your assignments, your essays, and you make sure that you follow the guidelines and hand them in, then you should pass. You should be able to do well. You should learn all that you need to learn. And then after completing the 24 subjects in a bachelor, or the number of subjects that you're doing, you should have a level of expertise that will enable you to go out into the schools with that level of expertise. So we should have that confidence. There will be roadblocks in the way. Some students won't do well in 2 or 3 subjects, but they'll be able to redo them, and then eventually everyone will get there. So you can have confidence that if you put the time in, then you should do well. So this is the 3rd of the assignments, and in order to engage with this assignment, this major project, then it's important that you read the question and that you think about what is required. So in this assignment, you're asked to undertake research into different ways of knowing and look at various views of the fields of knowledge in different cultures and compare these with your own and look at the impact in your practice as a teacher. So there's about 4 things we're looking at in this essay. Firstly, ways of knowing. And I've suggested that 2 major ways of knowing are modernity, with its focus on science, observation, measurement, mathematics. This is a particular way of knowing. And in this assignment in particular, we're going to look at the indigenous or First Nations way of knowing. And it could be said that the Hebrews in the Old Testament, or some of the people in the New Testament, followed a more naturalistic way of knowing. And this could be called an indigenous or Aboriginal way of knowing. And there could be a lot of other ways of knowing as well, including postmodern or pre-modern or traditional. There could be ways of knowing, but all of this is the discussion that we've had about how we know. And each week we look at some of those different ways of knowing. We looked at critical thinking in week 1. We looked at science, we looked at maths, and more recently we've looked at language, different ways of knowing. And that's what schooling is about. We want students to get to know the basics of spelling and maths and science so that they can engage well with the world in which they live. And then there are other subjects as well: physical education, art, music, all those other subjects. So you're to undertake research into different ways of knowing. And in doing this, you're going to have to choose some areas to focus on. And so I'm suggesting that in your focusing, you're going to have to choose what's the overall theme that you're going to be looking at. And I want you to write down numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, thinking about what's the focus that you're looking at. So Karen, what are your thoughts on, out of those 5, what would you be focusing on? And then pop your hand up if you've got someone else wants to speak up too. But Karen?
Well,
yep.
Okay, so in my notes that I've got written down, so in my religious knowledge, I'm going to do, wherever my piece of paper is, the maths as a way of knowing and what they use, and creative arts.
Yeah.
So I thought they were 2 ways of knowing that I found easier to explain
Yes.
with the Indigenous people. Going down to cultural awareness and Indigenous cultures,
Yes.
I thought we would look at, well, I would look at the implications with my worldview and their worldview on their particular beliefs.
Yeah.
Education, I'm looking at the 8 ways of learning and how we can relate that into our everyday teaching methods.
Yeah.
And what was the other one? Education for students. I've got down like intuition, tradition, like the Wesley quadrilateral and Christian ways of knowing.
Yeah. Now, one of the dangers there is don't let it get too big. But if you put Christian ways of knowing and then buried the Wesley quadrilateral in that, that would be one way to go. There's a slight danger that the quadrilateral could grow too big unless you put the quadrilateral first. If you put the quadrilateral first, then possibly, but you've got to think how you tie this all together. In 2 or 3 words, Karen, what would be the major theme that you're looking at in this essay, do you think?
In what regards?
So if you were to choose 2 or 3 words to say, in this essay I looked at, and then 2 or 3 words.
Worldviews of Indigenous Aboriginals. In relation to Christian worldviews. And comparing it to Indigenous groups from another country.
Now, one of the dangers is the more words you put into this one statement about what you are looking at, one of the dangers is that it becomes hard to tie it all together as one overall essay. And also another interesting thing is that you've introduced the concept of worldviews there. And so you have to make a decision. Is worldview going to be one of the major ways that you'll tackle this essay? If it is, then you're possibly going to need to say why it is important. That is why a worldview is important. What are these? That is, what are the worldviews? So if that was the case, you could certainly do that. And then if that's your major point that you're working with, you could say in our society, 2 areas of schooling and society that are important include maths, the creative arts, and you're going to focus on these. Karen, what year levels would you be teaching?
5, 6, so stage 3.
Yeah. So at some stage, you'd probably put in this essay will focus on year 5, 6, stage 3, because, and then you'll give a reason. These are the ones you're teaching. As well as that, you must focus in this essay on Indigenous people and Indigenous worldviews. And you could put there the 8 ways of learning as well. So I think it's sound. You'll have to keep focused on this overall presentation and argument that you are developing.
That's where I think I will struggle with that, because like you said, there's so much in that opening paragraph that maybe it's all going to get jumbled up.
So I'd be writing your introduction right at the end when you look over it all, and you could read through each paragraph and pull out a few words and sentences, and then write your introduction at the end when you know fully what you're introducing and working with. And then I'd keep an eye on the question. What's the question asked you about, such as worldviews, Indigenous, those areas. And so I think your structure is quite good, but there is that slight danger that you could go too far. Janelle, what would you choose out of these topic areas that you could be looking at, such as worldview, Indigenous, culture, education, critical thinking? What would you say your essay is about, Janelle, and how would you go about it?
Well, I've only just started to get into mine. It would be, I have looked into the Indigenous learning as well. Through our hub, we've been through the 8 ways of learning. So we've just looked at that as well. So I'm kind of got similar interest to Karen in that at the moment, since we're in the same place. So other than that, I've only looked at the Christian worldview. I haven't looked at anything else as of yet.
Yeah. So certainly you could start with Indigenous ways of knowing, and you could have there the 8 ways of knowing. And one of the things you'll often say in the introduction is why this is important. And so you would say that in classes that we teach in Australia, we'll often have Indigenous people in the class. It's important that we know the ways they know. And also you could put something about self-awareness as a teacher, the awareness that we come from a Western worldview, which has developed over 1,000 or 2,000 years, and from this Western modernist perspective or from a Christian perspective, there are certain ways in which we view things. How do we work with the Indigenous? All of that can be played around with in an area that could eventually become the introduction. But then when you get on to the details of your assignment, you'll really be looking at what are the Indigenous ways of knowing. So that'll be the core, perhaps, of what you would be looking at there. Hannah, what would you say is the major theme you'd be looking at? We've got one person looking at worldviews as a major theme, another one looking at Indigenous ways of knowing as a major theme. Hannah, thoughts on what your assignment would focus on?
Kind of, because it's a 2 kind of parts. So you've got the 2 Indigenous backgrounds to start, and then the next part is comparing it to our pedagogy. I'd kind of also focus a bit on, so there's the Indigenous way of knowing, but how that relates to my teaching. If I know that their heritage of learning is like a lot of Aboriginal culture is like dream time, story times as well. So how I can teach to that as well as to the other things in the class. Like you've got some Indigenous people, you've got some Western culture, so you have to, I think I'd focus on how the blend happens so that I don't quite know how to explain it.
Yeah, no, I like it. So you've identified that Indigenous ways of learning is a core area you'll have to research, gather information on, and there's going to be 2 Indigenous groups. One is going to be Australian and one could be another group, and it could be New Zealand Maori, or it could be the islands, or it could be Asian, another group. So you've got 2 Indigenous groups, and then you're starting to think a little bit about how Dreamtime, Storytime can be important for the Indigenous groups. How could you introduce that? And I really like what you said, Hannah, about the teaching. So you're going to focus on teaching as a major area. And so you could start either your essay with talking about Indigenous groups, or you could start in talking about how to teach, or you could start combining the 2 and talking about in teaching Indigenous groups we need to keep in mind, and then you could talk about that. So I think these are great ways to start. Bridget, do you have thoughts on which of those different areas that you would focus on? Worldviews, Indigenous groups, or culture, or as Hannah was saying, education could be a major theme in what you're looking at. Thoughts, Bridget, on what your starting point might be?
I'm thinking the culture. I think just as being an Aboriginal person, I think when you get to know the person's culture, you get to know the people, and you relate in the same way.
Yes.
And I think that'll come out in your teaching as well. So I think that's probably where I will start as well.
Yes. I always like your ideas, Bridget, in that you come up with these great ideas. So how did you say it? When you get to know what was the sentence?
When you get to know the culture of Indigenous people, you get to
Yes.
know the people better.
Yes.
And you have that relationship as well. Like the relationship gets stronger. And I think when I think of education in the critical ways, I kind of think of that combining it together, because when you're doing education, you are being, you know, thinking critically, and in a way you want the students to as well.
Yes, yes. And I love that sentence. When you get to know the culture of Indigenous people, you get to know the people better. Sometimes when you're talking things through, you can come up with great statements. Some people go for a walk in the park and take their iPhone and speak it into the iPhone and then come back. Some people have it automatically translated into words. So there's all sorts of ways in which you can develop these ideas in your own words. And often it's a good idea to write 2 or 3 times the number of words you need, and then just pick out those which work. And then if you try that, speaking it and writing it, you'll often find yourself repeating yourself. And so there could be 2 or 3 paragraphs that are just repeating what you said in the previous paragraph, and you have to copy and cut those out so that you go back to just 1 paragraph. But that's a great approach and very important. Olivia, thoughts further on the major idea that you'd start with and how you would work with it?
I think as I've just started a little bit, I've started with the ways of knowing, like the Christian way of knowing and the Indigenous ways of knowing.
Yes.
And how, like Hannah, with the educational side of things, how I could use it like to compare with my philosophy, and how I can use the 8 ways in my learning, teaching the children.
Yep. And once you've got an idea where you're starting, you've got the beginning of the journey, you gather that information and you move forward. Often the next step then is to go to Google Scholar or the college library to gather 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 books or resources, of which you'll start with 1 and then 2 and then 3. And as you work your way through, then you'll gather more and more material. Eventually, some of it you're wise to leave out and not run with, and then other of the material you'll want to rely on so much. You'll then discover that sometimes you're only working with 1 piece of material, and you need much more than just 1 reference in your resources. You need 8 to 12, and so you'll then begin to look at those more fully. So we're looking, let's say, at Indigenous people, ways of knowing in teaching in the classroom. So if I put that into Google Scholar, that should then bring up some resources that I can start looking at. And here's one that's come up. And so if we grab those, and then this one here that's come up. So if it's got nothing next to it, we know they're not going to let us access it, but this one's letting us access this resource. I might have to play around a little bit with working out chapter 6 of which book. So it's in a book here. Actually, maybe I've got the book here. It's Books Google. So it looks like I can go to this in Books Google, and that will help me find some more information there about the book itself. And then under books, right. So once you've got that, you can work your way through, and then you could use this chapter 6. That will give you a starting point. And then as you go through, you collect some more information. So there's another one here, Indigenous ways of knowing, and you collect your information. And then you look at it next day and you discover some of it was really useful. And then you look at it next day and you discover some of it you're just off on the wrong track, and you have to get rid of that. And so here, Journal of Philosophy of Education, 2020, Rethinking Environmental Education. There's a problem with that. I've seen this before. The focus on environmental education is not mostly what we're about, but you might get a few gems out of this, and even in the reference list at the end. Certainly, we've got this definition of Indigenous knowledge here, which could be useful. A little bit annoying that there's no date on it, UNESCO, but it's somewhat useful. So there's some good material here. And then you got Harvey 2009. So if you find Harvey 2009 on Indigenous knowledge, you may be able to put that in, Indigenous knowledge, Harvey 2009. And we could go at the end of the resource and have a look and see if it's there. So we've got some other resources. So you gather your resources, you work with that. But clearly, the big question is how you find these ways in which you engage. So here's Harvey, Indigenous knowledge, and we've got the reference there at the end. So if we did a search on that, we could gather more information from that as well. Here we go, Harvey. And so we may find that we've got the extra resources there. So let's go back now to look at the question, because I think that's the most important thing, is to go back. So you're doing research, and we've described in this subject and many of your subjects that academic research is how you gather information. And we've said that in academic research, you want these scholarly resources. You can't go to Wikipedia. You could start with Wikipedia, but don't let me know that you've started there. You could start with Encyclopedia Britannica, but again, there's probably better resources. And so scholarly research is gathering from the best scholars who are interacting with 20 or 30 or more references at the end. So when we looked at this chapter, when we went down to the end, we discovered that there was this list of a huge number of references. And so we know that this is a scholarly resource because it's got all these references at the end is one way to know that we've got a scholarly resource there. Then we've got to decide on what we're focusing on. And in one sense, we're focusing on different ways of knowing, but you've got to decide on what's meant by that. And one of the major areas that's mentioned here is that you've got to look at Indigenous groups. So that's probably a very good way to start, is doing research on what do we know about Indigenous knowledge? What can we find out about Indigenous knowledge? So really, now I could type in Indigenous groups and just do a search on that, but I'm worried that it would just bring up all sorts of material that could be all over the place, Wikipedia, etc. So if I do my search instead in Google Scholar, then that'll eliminate all these others. So Indigenous groups, Australia, education, culture. So these are some of the things that I am looking at. Classroom, teaching. So as I begin to look for resources that can help me understand the ways in which I am going to be working, then I've got material such as this. One of the difficulties is that this may well jump straight over to North American Aboriginal ways of knowing. Oh no, this is actually New South Wales, much closer to home. So I've got a good resource here, and it looks like it's a scholarly journal that I am working with. Critical Studies in Education, 2011, reasonably recent. So that would be a great resource. So I'd be going through resources such as this, gathering some insights. So in this study of 12 schools, looking at Aboriginal perspectives and knowledge, we then gather some information about Aboriginal perspectives and knowledge. And I think you've got a great resource. And once you get a few of these, you're looking at picking out the ideas. You then have to decide, if you find a nice statement like this, how will you work with this statement? So here's, most teachers struggle to define Aboriginal perspectives, opting for knowledge about Aboriginal people and their past and their culture. Now, you can paraphrase, that is to rewrite the resource in your own words, or you can summarize. So you gather the information from this scholarly article and then you have to acknowledge where it came from. So you need the page number, so you need the name of the person. So it's Harrison and Greenfield, and it's 2011. And then you also need to put down the page number. So it's Harrison and Greenfield, and it's 2011, and you need to put the biographical details there, and you'd look for the page, so you put down the page number as well, and then we've got a wonderful piece of resource. So the way I would do it, I'd read that sentence, and then I'd write it in my own words. There are many ways to describe Aboriginal ways of looking at the world. And I could even say, as Harrison and Greenfield have noted, 2011 page, or I could put at the end of the sentence, Harrison and Greenfield at the end of that sentence. And then there are many ways to describe Aboriginal ways of looking at the world, including, and then I'll put those ways, looking at the knowledge base, past, culture, but it'd all be in my own words as I gather that information. So we look at the question, we look at the major theme, we make a decision, what we're looking at, ways of knowing, cultures, and then also we begin to look at these different areas. And then towards the end of the essay, we look at our philosophy of education, pedagogy, and how this is put into practice and applied. So our structure is going to have one major theme, which we'll mention in the introduction and the conclusion, and then it's going to move into different ways of knowing about that theme, about the culture and education of Indigenous people. So there'll be a number of sub-themes through our essay, including Indigenous Aboriginal cultures. Note that you've got to focus on one group, so you don't want to be too general, just focusing on Aboriginal people worldwide. It's a good idea to choose one specific group, and you might even decide that after you've collected your information. Certainly in general, Indigenous people often are more focused on oral rather than writing or printing, more focused on a holistic, the religious as part of the world rather than the secular, that is, there's no gods involved in the world. You might also focus on the practical rather than theory, and you might honour the traditions and wisdom of the past. Another theme you'll look at will be teaching strategies for teaching individual people. So students will benefit from taking time to gather scholarly resources relating to their theme. I again encourage Google Scholar as one of those resources and your college library as another resource. And if you type in the words that relate to the main themes and ideas you're looking at, you'll gather that material. Make sure you note the author, year and page of the resource each time you work with it in each paragraph. And then at the end of the assignment, you put all of those references. Make sure you improve the paragraph structure, nice opening sentence, and develop that through. So can I get you to think of a question that you could ask about this assignment 3? So think about one question that you would ask about how to do this assignment 3. And it'll come back partly to what you find from your research, the resources that you gather information about, the ideas that you have, which will partly come from the weekly work that we do, and then also from your reflecting and thinking about the material that you gather. I guess one thing that stood out to me is this difference between the modern scientific and mathematical way of knowing, and then there are other ways of knowing which include Indigenous ways of knowing. My wife said to me the other day, Indigenous people are often very down to earth. That is, they know about the land about them. They know about the seasons that come and go. They look up to the sky and they know the weather. And they said so-called modern Western person often doesn't have a clue. The weather catches them by surprise, and a drought will catch them by surprise. I thought that's an interesting way of turning it around. Instead of elevating the modern Western person and saying the Indigenous people are struggling, my wife turned it around the other way and said it's Indigenous people who knows what's going on, and it's the modern person who sits in the cement houses in the middle of cement cities don't really know. So I thought that was interesting. So Janelle, what's your question, or what is your thought on the assignment?
My question, I suppose, would be, out of your 12 references that you'd like us to use,
Yes.
how many of those would you like us to find on our own? So some of our other lecturers only want us to use the content that we've been presented through our Moodle tiles and things like that. They don't want us to research outside of what we've been given at all. So I think that I'm finding that a bit confusing, because obviously the Google Scholar and things that you reference, it opens a whole world of information. And I think trying to guess which one's most relevant and which ones maybe aren't so strong adds a whole new complex idea to the essay itself. So would you like 50-50, or, you know, mostly use what you've given us already with a few outside sources? Or
I like the idea of 50-50, in that, you know, you're on fairly safe ground with the 50, in that you've got them from resources that have been used in the class, but at the same time, you are experimenting with and developing your skills in finding your own resources. So I think in the end, I don't think you're really doing research unless you're finding some of your own resources. But at the same time, if you are only finding your own, there's always the danger that you'll get off track and you will go off into a whole area that's not being covered. And so that's the danger. So I would suggest 50-50, and that can become 60-40 or 70-30 if you feel things are going one way or the other. But yeah, that would be my thought. I do like the idea of looking at resources that are there at the beginning of the course and in the notes. So I think that's very valuable. Yeah.
okay, thank you.
Sounds good. Hannah, your question or thoughts?
A similar kind of thing. I'm just struggling overall in the research section of it, in narrowing down my search criteria to actually get relevant information. I find my search criteria often covers like a wide thing, and I can't focus it down even when I try and use just like focused words. So like searching up Indigenous cultures, like you said, you can get all of a whole range of things. So that it's trying to, I'm struggling with the focus. I was wondering what you would suggest to get the right kind of focus for your search criteria.
Certainly it would be adding more words, and I can see how Indigenous culture becomes a huge topic that can take 100,000 words, whereas if you go to Google Scholar or go to the college library website, and as well as Indigenous cultures, put in 2 or 3 resources that are going to narrow this, and certainly pedagogy would be one, teaching is another, worldview is another, and then every day or so try a different combination of terms here. Some days you'll really strike gold, and then other days not so good. But I think within Indigenous culture, we're very much looking at teaching, we're looking at the classroom, we're looking at worldviews. We're looking at ways of knowing. I don't know whether ways of knowing is going to bring it up, but here we've got a few, and everyone takes you down a slightly different path. So the first one's going to look at science teaching. And so you've got to decide, are you wanting to go a little bit towards science teaching or not? This next one here, British Columbia and music education. Are you wanting to be over in Canada? Are you wanting to be into the world of music education? So you're constantly pulled in all of these different directions, and you're constantly hoping that you will find something about Sydney Aboriginal local groups and Christian perspectives that you want it all to come together for you. And there are days where none of it comes together. So certainly, have a look through and give it a go. Yeah.
And I had another slight one as well.
Yeah,
So
yeah, sure.
one of the cultures to be like an Australian Indigenous group, so like Aboriginal or Islander. With like in context of like Aboriginal, do you mean like even focus it down a bit more? So like in my area, it's the Darwal kind of.
How do we spell Darwal? How do we spell Darwal?
DHARW, I think, AL.
Yeah, something like that.
So like that's the people who live in my area kind of thing. So is it, do you want it like specific in that sense or a bit more broader?
Well, if you can get specific in that sense, then that will be much better, and that will be much more useful. One of the things in critical thinking is the more specific you can be, the more useful your thinking is, and the more you overgeneralize, the less valuable your thinking and ideas are. So I think if you've got people coming from that group, that area, the Darwal group, then gathering resources on that will be very, very valuable. So I would encourage that focus there. And then thinking about what are the key ideas that we are looking at. So again, thinking about how can we focus our Indigenous education approach, the worldview approach, what we're specifically looking at here. So knowing, knowledge. So I would certainly use that term, the Darwal people, quite a lot in Google Scholar and wherever you can. You can also do it in Google Books. So that's another way of looking. And so not always as easy as Google Scholar, but Google Books can be useful. So you go to Google, you put in your search, and then out of your search, you then choose books. And then there can be book resources here, and they will often let you read a 10th or 10% of the book. So that can be useful as well. Karen, what question do you have?
In the second part of the essay, where we need to give our own personal teaching philosophy, do we do, I know we've probably touched on this before, do we say the author of this essay, or can we go into I would?
Yeah, certainly the author of this essay would be the much more scholarly way to do that. And so that would be good, the author of this essay. At the same time, we recognise you don't have a lot of space to develop a philosophy of education or a pedagogical approach. So you're going to have to trim this down quite a bit. You'd probably want to focus on 3, 4 or 5 aspects of your philosophy of education, but it's a very useful exercise to think about your approach to education and what this approach is about. And so you'd think about what are the core things that you'd like to put down as your philosophy of education. And then I think it would be useful to put scholar so-and-so. So if you can put a scholar in who says that this is a very good approach to education, and the year of the scholar and the page of the scholar says this. So you might want an inclusive approach to education, a caring approach to education, and you look for scholars who talk about that inclusive and caring and all of those aspects of it. One of the other challenges is to tie together what you're doing in the first half of your essay with what you're doing in this latter part of the essay. So your philosophy of education being caring and inclusive and listening can all relate back to working with Indigenous people. The other thing you mentioned is the use of the word I, and I think that. One of the things we're emphasising in this subject is the importance of you and I and the subjective. That is, it's important in knowing that you can own the ways that you think and the way you write and the way you act. However, in doing that, it very easily shows a weakness that it's simply your opinion. So you've got to try and avoid the idea that I think that this is the way it should be done. And you've got to try and move to the more objective, evidence-based way.
I think I struggle with that a lot too.
Yes, and I think we all do.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we've got to work between these two. And certainly Soren Kierkegaard, he says that we need to keep the subjective way of knowing. That is, without that, you're not being authentic and real. If you're just saying evidence says, then there's a certain inauthenticity about that. However, you've got to show that the evidence does say. Yeah. Olivia, your thoughts, question and thoughts on approach?
No, my question was answered. I was just wondering whether it was going to be specific to the Australian, like not a whole Australian Indigenous culture, whether it had to be that one specific, like Wiradjuri or Yorta Yorta or something like that.
Yes, as much as you can, one specific group is much better. You may find difficulty with the group that you choose, and if that's the case, then you'll have to work around that in various ways, try another group in another part of New South Wales. But if you can get some good resources, and ideally 2 or 3 or 4 good resources that talk about that group, and then you've got to make a decision about the second group. And ideally...
Are we able to use an elder or such as a resource?
You could, yes. I think you could actually do an interview, and this can look really good in that.
So how do we base ourselves on that? So if you want it more like specific, as you said, obviously in our communities we have our Wiradjuri elders and things. So if we were to get some information, do we have to compile the interview to put as our?
Yeah, there are various ways to do it. The best way I've found is to take a recorder. You could even take 2, your iPhone and your friend's iPhone, so that if I was in one interview once and the battery ran out, and so you've got these things that can go wrong. So if you audio record with their permission and you tell them, is it okay if I audio record, and tell them what this is for? And so it has to offer fully informed interviewing, so you can't do anything sneaky, and it has to be all for their benefit. You can't do anything that would be harmful, such as you find out things they've done wrong, their criminal record or something. You've got to avoid anything that would be dubious. And so if you recorded that, then what you can do is a selected transcript. And so in a selected transcript, you don't have to transcribe every word. You can transcribe one sentence. And if you were then to give the date and some other details, roughly the place, then you've got a wonderful interview that you have collected. And this is often seen as a very valuable resource in that it's very original. No one else has collected that interview data on that date at that time and place. So it's very, very valuable. The slight difficulty is if people waffle on and on, then it's not so useful. And then the other side of it is that you have to interpret the data. And so this is often called coding, where you spot what they say. So if you can ask the right questions and ask about the way they view the world and get some good original data from that, then that's a wonderful resource there. So I would encourage that. You have to make a decision as to whether you include their name or not. And so some people will say John Smith, not their real name. So that's one way to go. The other way to go could be to include their real name. So if you did interview the Prime Minister, then you'd probably include his name, because this is valuable material that you have gathered. So you've got to make those decisions, and you've got to be slightly careful of ethical issues that could be involved there. Yeah, but I think interview data is wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
And probably if you gather interview data, it would be good to mix it 50-50 interview data with what scholarly resources say about that particular group. And then if you've got it 50-50, then you know you've got other perspectives as well as the original perspective. That would be an excellent mix. Yeah. Bridget, do you have thoughts on questions that you might have to ask?
I think everyone's answered my questions. I don't have any questions at the moment.
Yeah. What other group will you use, Bridget, as your second group, as well as one Australian Aboriginal group? What would you do for your second group?
I'm going to do Maori.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Very important, because we often have them in our classes. And also it gives you an opportunity to compare Australian Indigenous with Maori. So I think that's very, very valuable, very, very interesting. And then it raises a little bit of a question as to how we see things as Christians, because a lot of Maori are Christian. And so you can then think that through. And then there's the whole question of the marae and all the things that Maori do, and then how we work through that. But you don't have to go too far with that, but you can start to think through what we think as Christians. Of course, one of the things is, if we use the term Christian, just like using the term Aboriginal, there is such a wide range of Christian groups and views. And so there are so many different Christian groups and different views that are held by Christians that you could be thinking about and looking at as you go through. So you've got to think through what's meant by that and how you would engage with that.
Just one thing, sorry.
Yes, go for it.
How do we, like, you've got it broken up into two parts. Did you want each part titled or just?
Yeah, this raises the question of subheadings. I think subheadings are always quite useful. Often you don't have the subheading introduction. It's pretty obvious if it's the first paragraph that it's the introduction. Never quite sure about the second paragraph or third paragraph, but usually it should be obvious to the reader as to whether it's just one paragraph introduction or more before they get into the meat of the essay. I find it very useful to have the word conclusion before the conclusion of the essay. It's a good reminder to both the writer and the reader that you're at the conclusion of the essay, and you can have other subheadings. The rule with subheadings is that they should be able to be all removed and the assignment still makes sense. So you should be able to remove them all. If you can't do that, then you've overused the subheading to do work that is more than it should be doing. So they should be able to be removed with those subheadings. But it can be helpful for you as a writer and helpful for you as a reader. Yes, Hannah.
So like for a subheading, like transitioning into like part two of it, would you like maybe go comparing, so whichever Indigenous group we choose to compare with, like comparing this group to this approach, like comparing this group to the author's pedagogical approach to teaching or something, is that?
Yes, so certainly you could have Indigenous group 1, Indigenous group 2, and then you could have some sort of comparison there, and it could be comparison with Western ways of seeing the world or teaching. It could be the challenges posed. One of the rules, I think, of a subheading is to make them as short as possible, but still being as meaningful as possible. The danger with short subheadings is that they sometimes don't convey enough meaning except to the writer who knows what they mean. They need to make sense to the reader as well. And then the same with practical application. You could have a subheading under practical applications. And so Leonie asks, am I allowed to use different groups in South Africa instead of Australia? We would like you, where you can, Leonie, to use one Australian group, and then certainly you can use a South African group, preferably one Australian group, in that the grade is being given by an Australian institution in Australia. And so it's important to show an awareness of the Australian group, but certainly in South Africa, you could have one, or if you wanted to increase it to 2 South African groups, you could. So you could have 2 South African groups. That'd be another way to do it. So hopefully that is helpful, Leonie. Any other questions, Leonie, on that? No, that's good. So hands up, any other questions you've got about the assignment? So if there's no more questions on the assignment, let's have a look at some of the material that we're covering. And then as we look at this material, there could be other ideas that come up as well. The last couple of weeks, we've been looking at, in week 7, words and language, and then in week 8, emotions and the way in which they relate to critical thinking. And this is particularly important because with Indigenous groups, they're often using language and words in different ways, and they can be recognizing emotions, and they can be recognizing, even in the songs they sing, the poems that they're involved with, ways of knowing that are less focused on by the modern scientific people. Hannah, your thought or question?
Sorry, I was just wanted to check in with the word count. I know our reference list doesn't count. And do we have to do an abstract for this assignment as well?
You certainly don't have to do an abstract, and it wouldn't count in the word count. Hands up those who like to do an abstract. So if you wanted to do an abstract, you could. It's a whole art in itself to do a good abstract. And
then does the introduction class in the essay classes as part of the word count as well, doesn't it?
Yes, yes, yes. And then get in touch with me if you want to discuss the word count, in that I tend to like an essay that's a bit longer, 10% longer, than one that's 10% shorter, in that it often gives you space to more fully engage with the questions and the ideas, but it needs to be tied around a structure that's focused on one theme, one idea, which could be education that includes Indigenous people, while also being aware of the modern Western world and its needs that we live in, something like that. Any other questions? So certainly as we go, if you have questions, pop your hand up. So I think there was some really valuable material in the week 7 thread. It's Sowing the Story, Narrative Identity, Adult Formation. I've just taken what Karen has put down here. Life is full of challenges. The article Sowing the Story discusses how during life, the path to faith fulfillment can dissipate. Spiritual formation is important. And Christian Smith says that young adults, they can have diminished discipleship, but it's this frame of thinking, this narrative, this story that makes sense of the world that's important. And so I think that's a great insight. Down in Adelaide, there's a psychology study area that talks about narrative therapy. And they say in life, if you hit a bump in the road that messes up your story, then you often need an opportunity to think through what's my different way of understanding my story of my life during this life journey. And so the story we tell ourselves about our life can be important to our sense of identity. And when we hit a challenge, it can be quite a blow to our story and may need reworking. So there's a lot of great ideas in that. One of the major things I think in week 7 is that the language we use shapes the way we see the world and see ourselves. And so if you're part of a family that uses positive words to describe you and your life, then all of that positive language can be very useful. But if you're part of a family that has a lot of negative language, you will never amount to much, you are a failure, then that'll shape a child's thinking in your class as well. And so I think it's important for us as teachers that we use positive language and that we don't get thrown by students who are negative, by teachers and parents who are negative, that we need to keep the positivity up because it shapes the whole culture and environment. So week 7 looked at that. Karen, do you have any thoughts on week 7 and the narrative approach to the ways we think and critically think?
I thought it was an amazing article to read. That's from the Sage Journal. I enjoyed the narrative approach and how we as teachers can certainly not mould but model our beliefs onto them, bring that into our lessons in different ways, provide students with a nurturing type of schooling, because a lot of these kids, especially kids that have come from different backgrounds, and we often don't know as teachers what's happening at home, although with time we would get to know our students. We can provide them with stability and perhaps change their narrative to realise that school is a good place to be and that we are all part of their school family, so to speak, and feel safe.
Yeah, so good and so true. I think language that we use shapes that positive narrative there. Hands up, anyone else who's got thoughts on week 7 and language and narrative? Janelle, have you got any thoughts on language and narrative, how it shapes our world?
I had a bit of a personal approach to this. I feel like the reading was a bit restricted in its age groups. So coming in to the learning phase of my life at what some would say the back end. So I feel like we're more chapters than just the 3 phases. Each chapter of our life has that, your author and your... So I was just like in my answer, I sort of say that I've reflected probably more so on the past and the present and my future now moving into this stage of my life, but really I've already nearly completed my parenting stage of life, with my youngest child now being sort of 11. Like, so I kind of had a hard time justifying that what I've done in my past, now I've readjusted that to face my future again. So I'm kind of back at the beginning, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so good. And it shows the value of this whole exercise in thinking through the different ways we can see the chapters and stages and phases of our life. And so it's quite important. And then our students in our class will be telling stories about their own life in their mind as they sleep, even subconsciously. And other teachers, yeah,
I think that whole lockbox theory of our faith getting put on hold was pretty that was very much a thing as well, because it seems to be the first thing that you think, all right, I know what I know, and I love my children and whatever else, and then you move on to the whole part of raising your children, but it's not until now that you think back about what you've done that you realise that your faith was present the whole time that you were raising them.
Yeah, so true. And we get challenged, don't we, to think
Oh,
more. Yeah.
Definitely do.
Yeah. And it's important to have sort of that humble recognition, but to keep a broader sense of understanding as well. Hannah, thoughts on week 7, sowing the story, narrative identity and its role?
Yeah, so I actually quite enjoyed the reading and just looking at the different levels of it, I guess, and looking at how, like Bridget was saying, that it was focused on the one, but it also did have relation to the past and the future. And that was one set age group, but like she said, we're still doing it now. Like we're always changing, we're always growing. So we'll keep on doing it like as a cycle, and the stories that we help put into kids' lives, you might not see an active, like, what's it called, outcome from what you've been teaching them right then and there, but later on they'll be able to look, that when they get to the stage of looking back on it, it will impact a bit of their future and how that cycle just keeps going.
Yeah, so good. And different people from different families, different parts of the world will have these different views of their life and the world around them. And then Matilda said she had a bit of trouble with this, in that the author can talk about performance, whereas God's done things for us. So I think that's important. There's some other readings that are up there on Moodle. The idea behind Plato's writing in Cratylus is that names and terms do have meaning, and that rather than just a convention of this is the way a culture views things, there is reality as well in the natural world. So there's some interesting discussion from that. Encyclopedia Britannica has a section on the philosophy of language. So the language we use helps us to understand and know about the world. And even in poetry, song, story, and the humanities, there is use of language in ways that touch our lives, sometimes our subconscious in the deeper ways. And John Dewey makes that claim when he writes about art and education. So there's a whole discussion in week 7 on that, which was very valuable. So if you have any further thoughts or questions on that, Leonie, do you have any thoughts on week 7 and language?
Not really. I'm just scanning through what I wrote in my forum.
Yeah.
But I think that obviously language is a very good way, in which God constantly communicates with us, and he forms stories through us to to talk to other people. Like he uses our lives as an artwork for other people to like see his beauty.
Yes, excellent, so good. And that's so true, isn't it? Is to allow God to communicate to us through the way in which he forms these stories in our lives. And we often tell those stories to each other and to the students as we work with them. And then in week 8, we had that interesting resource on the power of thinking, in that in your subconscious and in instinct, there can be thin slices of thinking. So it's about the adaptive unconscious. And so if you're flying a plane, or if you're riding a motorcycle or a fast car, often you've got to rely on thin slices of instinct to make decisions. And so that raises interesting thoughts on other ways to know. In week 8, there's a good video by Kate Karafotis on self-awareness in emotional intelligence. And so in the classroom, it's important that as teachers that we have self-awareness and that we can manage ourselves and our emotions, and we can help the students manage themselves and their emotions. And there was the mention there of the 5 pillars of emotional intelligence, which we as teachers need, but we should develop in our students where we can. The first is self-awareness. So when you're feeling angry, it's important to understand what is happening. My face is going red. Little Johnny next to me has poked me. And so instead of just turning around and biffing him with our fist, it's important that we think through, why am I threatened by being poked by the student next to me when I'm sitting in a class? And so emotional awareness helps us to understand that I feel my sense of identity is threatened. I feel my sense of power is being challenged by this other student who pokes me. Now, as one other teacher told me, that if we say to the student who's been poked, I will see you at lunchtime, or I will see you at the end of the day, or I will speak to your parents. Can you think what's wrong with that whole approach? Because what's wrong with that approach is that if you leave it to lunchtime or the end of the day or speaking to the parents, you're not dealing with the problem. You're dealing now with, how do we relate to parents, or how do I feel at lunchtime? So it's much better where you can to, even though it's the height of the moment and the adrenaline's flowing, to talk at the time when they know what the emotion is, because they may not be able to remember so much about the emotion later in the day. Janelle, what's your thought about dealing with the issue? So someone's poking someone else, and then what's the danger of leaving it till the end of the day or talking to their parents, as opposed to encouraging them to think about, why are you upset? Why did you do that at that moment?
I think it's always important to deal with the spark as well as the fire. So a lot of people only react to the fire and don't spend the time to listen about why that started. So I think it comes with a lot. I've worked a fair bit in behavioural management, and people that don't take their time to read the strategies or know the triggers, then don't deal with the situation very well. So I think it comes back to knowing your students individually, knowing what their triggers are, and then how to deal with it, as well as dealing it at the time. So some of those kids don't remember what they did after their trigger goes off. So you need to give them that 5 minutes before you can pull them back in and actually have a conversation about why it did happen. But it still needs to be addressed at the time.
Excellent. Yeah, that's really summed it up very, very well. Know the triggers, know the strategies, and deal with it at an appropriate time, whereby they will think through what was happening, how did they respond. And I think as well, keep that positive culture going. The reason I'm talking to you about this is because I am concerned for you. I have faith in you. Janelle, what do you have thoughts on keeping a positive culture? Because it's very easy as a teacher who's super powerful and all powerful to use a put down. You know, if you were paying attention to what was going on, or you could really push.
I think if you're not positive about it, like there's always a reason. Getting to the point of being abrupt about it, you're never going to get to that reason. So I think it's good to keep a positive spin on it. It's also important to address it at that time when they come and talk about it, and come up with new strategies so that they know that when they get to, like, this is it could be a new development for them, and we go, we've got to recognise that this is a trigger now, and that has triggered you, and how are we going to go about addressing this in the future? So it's got to have a positive spin as to come up with that strategy to stop it happening again. I think also addressing it at the time we need to be careful and make it a positive experience as to not to hit more triggers. So, you know, if you get to a landmine, you want to turn around and go back. You don't want to try and run the gauntlet.
Yes. Yes, you can set off a huge number of landmines, can't you? Which is
Correct.
incredibly destructive. Yeah, I love that. So the first point is develop self-awareness in yourself as a teacher, but particularly important in the students. Secondly, in terms of EQ, emotional quotient, develop self-management skills, both for yourself as a teacher, but also for the students learning to manage emotions. So when you feel annoyed, what are the ways of responding to this? And some exercises to do this can include acting out, writing through, reflecting on emotions. Certainly talking it out is important. And in talking it out, you place your feelings on the table, you lay them out, you place what's happened on the table, and so you lay it all out, then you can actually understand what's going on. Thirdly, look at motivation. What's motivating these different behaviors? Understand the motivation. Fourthly, develop empathy, understand how others feel. And then fifth, last but not least, develop social skills that help you to deal with others, to work as a team, and to negotiate with conflict. And then there was 5 minutes or more in the video by Daniel Goldman on emotional intelligence, in which he talks about self-awareness and self-management and how to handle positive and negative emotions. And so it's important that we recognize the causes of negative emotions and the cause of positive emotions and what they involve. So we also had optional video on emotional intelligence and skills of our students. And we recognize from that there are many different emotions and it's possible to classify these. And if you Google the different emotions, you'll find some great resources out there. Don Hockbury and Sandra Hockenbury in their book, Discovering Psychology, talk about the aspects of emotion. There's an actual experience or thought, such as if you almost get hit by a car, then you jump out of the way and your heart beats and you sweat. So there's the actual experience. And then there's the mental subjective experience. That person was speeding or whatever. And then as well as that, there is the embodied physiological experiences. So my heart's beating, I'm sweating, I've jumped out of the way. And there are also a series of psychological and physiological responses that then go on. So we begin to think through, what were the causes of the car almost hitting me? Was it their fault? Was it my fault? And often there's a mixture of both. I wasn't paying attention, but at the same time, the car was going a bit fast and they were watching their phone or something like that. So there's complex responses that are taking place and there's complex emotions, anger, also gratitude that I'm alive, didn't get hit by the car. There's processing, there's thinking through. And then there's finally mental, behavioral, and expressive responses. I'll watch out for a car. So emotions are complex in that they have a lot of triggers and then there's a lot of responses. So, Karen, what are your thoughts on the importance of an understanding of emotion in the classroom for the students, for the teachers? What are your thoughts on this week 8 topic, the importance of understanding emotions in terms of the way we know things? Thoughts?
Yep. Firstly, I'd like to go back, excuse me, to what Nell said about, can we just scroll up, Dr. Sam, a little bit to have a look at triggers, I think it was, the triggers. I wanted to give an example. At the moment, we have a new student at school who's come in from School of the Air. So this is his first time in a classroom setting as such. He is struggling with classroom behaviour in the sense he does not understand what he needs to do. So he doesn't know that you must, put your hand up to ask a question, or you must, you can't just walk out of the classroom. All those sorts of things he has to learn, and he's in year 5. So at that age, it's quite for him, perplexing, because he's got all these emotions going through him. So back to the emotional side of things about, doing the right thing. This is all new for me. How do I get my head around it? I don't know anybody. My teacher's new. So that would be quite traumatizing to him. So, and we're also trying to find out where he sits academically within the class, because he is not completing his work because he's never had that person over his shoulder as such, making sure that he does his work when he's meant to do his work. So it's all this push and pull for him. So I can see from an emotional perspective how traumatizing that must be him as a student.
Yeah.
And a young child, because
Yes.
that'd be quite hard to deal with. Yeah.
Yes. No, that's so important and so true. Hands up those who know the Ben Carson story with gifted hands. Yep. So Hannah, tell us about Ben Carson, because his is a similar story, isn't it, Hannah? Here he was in school getting low grades, and he was from a disadvantaged background. And so, yeah, what do we know about this story, about an example of someone whose life turns around?
His mum decided to actually start teaching him at home as well as at school. So he was, I think, failing reading or some other things at school, and nothing was really being done. And so she decided to give him like a reading list. And from there, he gradually started going through school and getting better and better. And she would keep giving him new stuff and instilling the habits and helping him develop. And then he ended up becoming a really gifted doctor. And he did one of the first conjoined twin separations.
Yeah. So it's a great example, and I guess this happens all the time, is that people who are encouraged and able to rewrite their story. He went from someone who was the class clown to someone who did very well with his class.
And being it,
go for it.
Being educators too, I think it's our role to be proactive instead of reactive. So this all comes down to our intuition. So we do know if something's up. So, what triggered the outburst, that child came into the classroom in the morning down in the tooth, wasn't happy, or which was unusual, what's caused that behavior. So all that sort of stuff, I think you sort of will grasp over time.
Yeah, no, that's so good. And if we ask, so Bridget, your thoughts on emotion in the classroom?
I would have to, from experience, I think working in the school and alongside a professional teacher, obviously, just really identifying what has caused the emotion, I think, and from then you can actually know how to react in a way as a teacher. Like it may be they're coming in from lunch and they hate maths, like they're about to do maths, and we know, okay, they're going to come in and be, suki lalas or whatever because they don't like maths. How can we approach that in a fun way or in a different way so they can enjoy that subject or enjoy something that, so probably identifying, I would say, is how I would.
Yeah, so good. And that's the important thing, is to better understand emotions. And if you wanted to go further, you could look at some scholarly resource that discuss what are the nature of emotions and how they're both embodied. There are physical things happening, they're subconscious and conscious. There are a lot of things happening when our minds process feeling down, feeling up, feeling disempowered, feeling empowered, feeling bullied, feeling as though we're on top of the world. Aristotle wrote about these things, in which he identified 14 different emotions: fear, confidence, anger, friendship, calm, enmity, shame, shamelessness, pity, kindness, all of these different emotions. And he believed they were associated with pleasure and pain, and with virtues, good things and vices, weaknesses, and our human desires and appetites. And there are articles in, say, the Stanford Encyclopedia and other resources on emotions. So emotions is fascinating. There's also the resource there on Robert Plutnik's 8 primary emotions, which is quite a useful resource. And so you can think about what's going on in the different emotions. But I think one of the major things is just to encourage the students to be more aware of their emotions, how they respond, and then how they can better identify their emotions, how they can better work with their emotions, how they can be in control and in control of their responses. So I think that's a particular important area. And to recognize if you feel angry, you can start to put that to one side, and you can overcome emotions by working through the issues thoughtfully and carefully and resolving those issues. So there's Christian writing on emotions, and then there are lots of other areas of emotions. The other thing to look at is the humanities, that is the arts and poetry and music. These are just as important as the sciences and mathematics, and often it's in the arts where you're storytelling, or in music or poetry, that you can give expression to emotions and say, I feel good or I feel bad. Over the last few months, I've managed to go to a couple of Shakespeare plays. One was Julius Caesar, and another one, Much Ado About Nothing. I think that really wrestles with how we feel when things are going bad and things are going good. And there are many narratives in the Bible that talk about the ups and downs of life, whether it be Job or whether it be Joseph or whichever of the books. So it's important that students have opportunity to talk through their emotions and feelings. And Damasio, he is a studier of the brain and neuroscience. And so Damasio, let me put that in. So neuroscience of emotions, feelings, and it's Damasio. And there's a lot of resources by emotions, in which Damasio writes about, in many ways, we're a feeling person who think on occasions rather than being a thinking person who feels. So it's worth thinking about these different ways in which we engage with emotion. And so I encourage you to look at the resources by Damasio, and you'll find it very helpful. So Antonio Damasio on the neuroscience of emotions is very useful. So he says, basically, our life is often run by our emotions and not so much by our thoughts. And if a student does well in thinking or critical thinking, it's often because they're emotionally committed. And if they do badly, it's often because they got the wrong emotional attitude to what's going on. So there's a lot of resource on Damasio and the importance of feelings and the ways in which understanding our feelings can be very, very helpful to us. So that's Antonio Damasio and the neurobiological perspective on emotion and feelings, in which he says they're important in everyone's life and we need to acknowledge them and their importance. And similarly, the arts and art and music and storytelling could be the place where students get the major breakthrough in their education, rather than just in learning the maths times the tables. And often in education, people want to focus on the sciences of maths and times the tables. And C.P. Snow said there's a danger of dividing the world into two cultures, one being the sciences and then the other humanities and art and music and poetry, which some see as less important. John Dewey, the famous educational philosopher, wrote that the modern world often accepts science as the path towards deciphering the world around us, whereas the scientific language is only a signboard directing us towards the city. The reality of what goes on in the city, the real life, is often described by arts and music and poetry and feeling. And you may find that with Indigenous ways of knowing, that they may engage more fully with the whole of life and what life is about, and that the modernist scientific approach, which tries to think everything, may not fully engage with all that life is about. Maslow too sought to help change the negative view about emotions, and Maslow said that students, when they can understand and use their emotional commitments in positive life-enhancing ways, they do well. Leanne Fried, in her book, writes, schooling is an emotionally laden process for the students and the teachers and the parents, and aspects of cognition that are the focus of school: learning, attention, memory, decision-making, motivation, social functioning. They're not just about thinking and cognition, they're also about emotion, my commitment, my interest. And you can read that article in Leanne Fried's teaching about emotional regulation in the classroom. So the development of emotional regulation is important for the students in our classroom, for teachers as well. And having to regulate students and their emotions is one of the most commonly reported tasks and stresses of teachers. As Fried says, expressive environments have often been found to develop emotional capacity. So giving students an opportunity to play a musical instrument, to paint, and then to talk about how the picture or the music expresses their emotions can be a very important role for our students. So that's just another area that you can look at. So can we go through now, in having looked briefly at language, week 7, at emotions, week 8, and we began with the discussion of the assignments. Can we go back now to looking at the assignments? What do you think you'll do? How will you do it? And we'll go through each one, talking about assignment 3. And assignment 3 is asking the question, if there are different ways of knowing, and Indigenous cultures sometimes focus more on the oral or the relational as opposed to other ways of knowing, which could be more the scientific or the technical. How do we in our classroom show an awareness of the Indigenous ways of knowing? And then in the essay, how do we show our awareness of at least 2 Indigenous groups and the way they know, and how we're able to take that into account in our teaching? Bridget, your thoughts on how you'll go about the big major project worth 50% here?
Reference properly.
Yes, that's a good way to go. Oh, and gathering the information and then referencing the information
as you go.
So I think that's, you got a starting point, you gather the information, and then you reference it as you go. Leonie, your thoughts on this assignment?
So I haven't really given it much thought, but I was thinking of working like education and knowledge and wisdom in different cultures, like working those 2 together. And then as we were talking now, bringing the emotions into the classroom, and how other students may have different experiences in the classroom, and how as teachers we need to relate to those emotions, and just to encourage them. So that's just like the base.
Yeah, and you're just gathering scholarly material that then relates to that. And we've mentioned Google Scholar, we've mentioned the college library, Google Books is another one, and so there's various ways to gather those resources. Which South African group will you look at, do you think, Leonie?
I was thinking of maybe using the Xhosa group.
Yeah. No, that sounds good. And then you should include one Australian group, if you wanted to include another group as well, then that would be possible as well. Janelle, your thoughts on the major project and how this will unfold?
Like I said before, maybe just how I'm going to bring that nurturing learning into the classroom without going overboard, without spoon feeding, but the different experiences, how our Indigenous students, they're raised in a different environment. So many different environments. It's not very colloquial, really. So the different family environments as well, like the home environments that we've got to deal with. So bringing that, you've got to have that outside knowledge to bring into your classroom. So
yeah. Now, you used a wonderful term there, Janelle, which was the term nurturing. And sometimes you stumble across a good term like that. It would be interesting to know whether you could use that to develop a paragraph around it or even more around it. And so if you could find a good resource. So I just typed into Google Scholar nurturing learning, and then you could also think about what's it mean to nurture. And so if you found some good insight into the meaning of nurturing, and you could look at, you know, what this term meant and the application of it. That could be just one area. So every now and again you come across an idea. So to nurture means to care for and to encourage, to value, all of those terms. So that might be something that you might work with. And if you did, you could introduce that either at the beginning or in paragraph 2 or 3 near the beginning. You could say this assignment will argue that a caring, loving approach, and the word nurturing is used, and then you bookend it near the conclusion. You say this approach has shown that nurturing is very valuable in doing that. So yeah, I think that whole caring approach there can be important. You could also bring in the argument that this is a Christian approach, that is God in love your neighbour as yourself, and also Jesus in the Good Samaritan and other passages talks about nurturing and love as being the core. And if you could find some good Christian scholars and writers, so again, Google Scholar, and then if you found a scholar and writer who talked about Christian approaches to teaching and love, caring, those sorts of material there. And I'm thinking Parker Palmer might have something, but yes, here we go. So Parker Palmer, The Courage to Teach, and then you might find other resources there. Again, you've got to be careful that you don't go off track, but at the same time, if you can gather some ideas and bring it together, then that would be very, very useful. Hannah, how would you tackle this assignment 3?
Again, I think a bit similar to what I was mentioning earlier, but incorporating the language that we use, and like Karen was saying, the nurturing aspect, that the awareness of the impact of some of what we might teach, whether it's like from a Christian teaching perspective or the curriculum teaching perspective. It might be emotionally an emotional trigger for some of our students as well. So we also need to be able to be aware of that as we teach and how we teach it, so that it's beneficial for the whole class, kind of thing, I guess.
Yeah. And of course, there's one of the dangers is that we're talking about week 8 and emotions, is that your whole essay can focus on week 8. So I guess that's always a slight danger. But at the same time, I like some of these ideas that you say it's not about what we teach, but it's also about how we teach. It's about the environment that we establish. There's a lot of areas there. And as you gather your material, you'll sort through it, some of it will feel a bit repetitious, but you'll rework it until you find it. Karen, your thoughts on how you'll tackle this assignment 3?
I think the biggest or the most important thing would be to make sure that everything is collated well and that you stay on task and you keep your paragraphs, what's the word I'm looking for, on topic perhaps, rather than chopping and changing, because I tend to do that a lot.
Yes.
Think of something and I should go, oops, no, that belongs up there. And yeah.
And I like what you say about organisation, structure, paragraphing. And someone has said that if you had 7 days to do an assignment, that they would spend 3 days gathering the material and writing out the notes. And then they would spend 1 day doing the big structure. And then they would spend 3 days editing and reworking. And so it's often in the editing and reworking that they get this wonderful flow that goes through. And often we think out of 7 days, we spend 6 days gathering, half a day structure and half a day editing. But they've said that won't give you a well-produced piece of work. It's the polishing of it at the end that gives you a good piece of work. So that sounds similar to what you're saying there, Karen, which is very good. And Olivia, what will be your approach to this 3rd assignment?
To get more scholarly, I think, would be mine.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I struggle at the moment, but
Yes.
Yes.
And that has to do with finding the scholarly resources such as Google Scholar. And the big difficulty there, of course, is that they often go off to the left and the right once you find them, because people have written in all these different areas, and keeping focused is combined with the scholarly resources. That is, we're about education, we're about the classroom, and we're very much about Indigenous ways of knowing. The other thing that we want to do a little bit is to go deeper and to ask what is it about the Indigenous ways of knowing, which could be to connect to the land, it could be to connect to each other, it could be to connect to their traditions. There are various ways in which we could dig a bit deeper into what's the Indigenous way of knowing mean compared to our modern Western way of knowing. And that could be a bit more individualistic. It could be a bit more telling rather than listening. And so it's this digging deeper, but if you can use the scholars to help us dig deeper, then that's going to be very useful. So each time you find a new idea and thought, do a little scholarly search, and if it doesn't work out, that's fine, put that aside, and then next day do another little scholarly search on the college library, into Google Scholar, into Google Books, gather that information, and you'll do well. So thank you each one. I think it's been very valuable today to work through some of the things. If you've got any questions about assignment 3, then certainly send them through. If you need or want to send a draft through, then I can have a look at that and give you some suggestions there. And I look forward to seeing your work as you go forward. And I look forward in 2 weeks' time as we start to draw together many of these other ways of knowing. I look forward to that next session where we can share together. So thank you each one, and we'll see you in 2 weeks' time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just a reminder, before you put assignment 3 in, you will have to complete that feedback form. So you'll see that on the notes as well. Thank you. Bye, each one.
Thank you.